Hello everyone. The theme for this week is putting your leadership development plan into action. So here in Module 8, we explored several strategies for modeling leadership, and then we discussed actions that we take in developing leaders of the future. One of our resources this week was the Little Book of Leadership Development. And so in that small text, the authors presented 50 different ways to develop leadership capacity in others, many of which are closely related or even inspired by the exemplary practices that are mentioned in the Leadership Challenge. I find that most of them were small, easy to implement tips that will make a big difference no matter what organization one's a part of. A few of them I found really intriguing, such as one called the Pygmalion effect, which is the principle that if people are led to expect to do well, they tend to do well. A different way to say this is to expect the best in people, and they will do their best to rise to the occasion. Another strategy that I appreciated was one called helping diagnose the challenge, technical or adaptive. This, of course, was a nod to the idea of adaptive leadership, championed by longtime leadership researcher Ron Heifetz. Adaptive leadership has long been a favorite of mine because it forces leaders not just to respond to challenges, it forces leaders to respond to challenges beyond what is on the surface. These surface or simple responses are simply known as technical solutions, whereas adaptive solutions require a whole new way of thinking about the problem. Adaptive leadership requires thinking deeply about things and seeing the world in new and different ways. This book, the Little Book of Leadership Development, has been a favorite of mine for a long time, and I hope that many of you have gained some appreciation for its practicality and its simplicity. So in this module, we also reflected upon the short document called Develop Others. And that document served as a template really for self-reflection for us as leaders. I like to think of this document as a leadership mirror, if you will, with each principle mentioned as an honest question about our own competencies and dispositions of leadership. So both of these resources in many ways are really common sense practices, and all of us at some point or another can say, well, of course that makes sense, but the more poignant principle this week has been the notion that, despite all this good research and the practical suggestions, in leadership, common sense doesn't mean common practice. So it's therefore the leader's job to bridge those two things, common sense and common practice, together. Next week, we'll delve into some of the barriers in implementing an action plan. And more broadly, how can we as leaders navigate those things, ideas, and many times people, all those things that have a divergent view of how you view the world. One way to look at the next module is that it's really an extension of this module this week. So in other words, if this week we talked about our plans, then next week we'll talk about how we implement those plans. In other words, we just talked about the conceptual, the ideal, but at some point there has to be a call or things have to be put into action. And I use the term the real. The real includes taking into account the different things that we have to consider as leaders to get there. So it's not too early right now to start thinking about your last paper, which will be due at the end of the class in Module 10. So as we did in previous modules with the paper due, I have a plan to have a video with tips and insights and cover any last things before we need to do before the class ends. So I will actually post this next week so that you'll have a couple weeks to think about the paper. I'll give some tips, etc. One final thing is this week you've had a guest facilitator, Jane Stockton. So I want to give a big shout out to Jane, who has done a great job in facilitating the discussion. I've seen a lot of your discussions take on a very practical tone, which is great because you're always thinking about what I call the leadership question. This is great in terms of theory, but what does it actually do? How is it going to apply in your setting? So thank you, Jane, for some great work this week. Well, that's all for now. And as you have throughout the class, continue to wrap up anything you need to over the weekend, and I'll see all of you online.